when young Marine sniper Tommy strikes up a flirtation in an internet chat room with an 18-year-old girl calling herself TalHotBlond, he thinks he's hit the jackpot. Before long, Tommy and his TalHotBlond are exchanging gifts, love letters, phone calls, and eventually, cybersex. However, when a third party enters the chat, this online romance goes from fun and games to murder. Hello and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love. And this week I'm putting a spotlight on the case I'm calling Murder in Real Life. In the spring of 2005, a young, muscular, handsome Marine bound for Iraq named Tommy, in search of a little stress relief, finds himself drawn to online gaming sites for poker and blackjack, eventually finding his way to the teen chat room for the popular Pogo site. Right away, he starts to receive instant messages from a girl with the screen name TalHotBlond. She says her name is Jessie, and that she's 17 and about to graduate from high school in Oak Hill, West Virginia, known as the town where Hank Williams Jr. died while on his way to perform a concert. Jessie was a senior in high school preparing for prom, and then not much after that. She was a small-town girl with big dreams and no idea how to make them happen. Cue Don't Start Believing. Tommy tells her that he's 18, 6 feet tall, muscular, and headed out to boot camp. And on the very day that they meet, Jessie sends pictures of herself in a bathing suit to Tommy to let him know that she is no catfish, but indeed the real deal. She is blonde and beautiful with long golden legs, just like her screen name says. As Tommy said in the documentary TalHotBlond, the pics that Jessie sent him were, quote, not pornographic, but provocative. Naturally, Jessie wants to see what Tommy looks like, so he sends her a picture of himself in full military dress, proving that he, too, is exactly who he says he is. Except he's not. Not by a mile. Because Tommy is really Thomas Montgomery, a balding, doughy, 46-year-old married father of two who works as a machinist for the Dynabraid factory in Clarence, New York, near Buffalo. He's a Sunday school teacher, heads up his daughter's swim club, and was considered to be a devoted husband and father. If you looked up the words mild-mannered and upstanding in the dictionary, Thomas's picture would be staring back at you. As one member of the community said in TalHotBlond about Thomas, quote, I thought he was one of the nicest neighbors we had. Ken Case, former prosecutor, commented in TalHotBlond that Thomas was, quote, not hated by his fellow coworkers, but people thought he was a little awkward. And awkward Thomas has hit a midlife crisis. He's bored to tears with his job, but family obligations kept him tied to the steady paycheck. He's overcome a drinking problem, and his 17-year marriage is swirling down the drain in part due to his being impotent. So Thomas kept all of this a secret from Jessie, though when he said he was in the military, that was true 30 years prior. His screen name, Marine Sniper, was a nod of sorts to his military service. Though he did qualify as a sharpshooter, he never trained to be one. He never saw combat and was definitely not on the verge of shipping out to boot camp before being deployed to Iraq. Thomas reasoned to TalHotBlond that making up this fantastical identity was harmless because, quote, I knew I was never going to meet this girl. You can say what you want on the internet. And most people do. Thomas found that being someone else on the internet provided an escape from the drudgery of his life. As clinical psychologist Rex Bieber noted in TalHotBlond, quote, this is a depressed person, a stimulus-hungry person in a dead-end marriage and a dead-end life. A dead end that would be good enough for many, but not good enough for him. And in fact, Thomas, as Tommy, spins wholly elaborate tales about his life to Jessie. He tells her that his mom died of cancer when he was 12, that his father was also in the military, and that the whole reason he had enlisted was because he had sexually assaulted a cheerleader when he was in high school. He also said that he was a loner and that he planned to take his own life while he was in Iraq. These tales of woe draw in the sweet, sensitive Jessie, who told him she was proud of him and believed in him, that his mistakes didn't define him, and to stay alive for her. Tommy messaged Jessie that she was, quote, the best thing that had ever happened to him. Thomas and Jessie moved their online conversations offline, talking on the phone late into the night when Tommy was supposedly off duty. Their conversations soon escalated to explicit virtual sex, as Tommy, figuring he's never going to meet Jessie, continues to spin elaborate tales about being shipped off to boot camp, going deep undercover, and being thrust into combat. As former prosecutor Ken Case noted in TalHotBlond, these wild stories and the anonymity of both the internet and the telephone, quote, allowed him to be something that he wasn't. He could do anything he wanted to do and be anybody he wanted to be. It's the kind of thing that you see more in teenage boys who just have crushes and get completely infatuated. Except he was 47. He was obsessed and consumed with this fantasy. Thomas takes the fantasy to an even more absurd level, as if that's possible by this point, by having Tommy ask Jessie to marry him. He said that he didn't even think twice about it, commenting in TalHotBlond, quote, she's not going to get hurt. She's a young girl. She'll find somebody else. By now, Thomas's wife, Cindy, starts to catch on that something is rotten in Denmark. As The Guardian reported, Thomas was obsessed with the computer, chasing his daughters to get off of it so that he could plant himself in front of the screen late into the night, and noted that Cindy, quote, couldn't compete with his new obsession. So her suspicions are all the way confirmed when a package of lacy red panties from Jessie shows up at their house, and Cindy intercepts the package. She confronts her husband and tries to shock him back to reality by reminding him that this girl is 18. You're not. You're leading this girl on. You have a family. And what in the actual F is wrong with you? Cindy actually writes a letter to Jessie with a family photo, outing her husband as a fraud and encouraging Jessie to let it go. For her part, Jessie is devastated and disgusted to learn that she was messaging with a married, middle-aged liar. She moves on from Tommy to another gamer that she remembers seeing in the game rooms, and as it happens, Thomas and this other gamer, who goes by the screen name Beefcake, also works at Dynabraid, which is where, remember, Thomas works. And Jessie knows this, and initially she reaches out to Beefcake to find out what he knows about Thomas. So Beefcake is Brian Barrett. Stocky, dark-haired Brian is working part-time at Dynabraid to save up money for school. He's a student at Buffalo State College and has dreams of being a teacher. As his baseball coach and athletic director at Starpoint High School in Pendleton, Tom Sarkovics, told the New York Times about Brian, quote, he was kind of an easygoing, quiet kid. He'd do anything you asked him to do, never complained about running, never complained about drills. Brian, unlike Thomas, is actually closer to Jessie's age, and the two click. Before long, Jessie plunges headlong into the same sexually explicit entanglement with a guy she's just met online. There are sexy pictures, they're sharing fantasies, and once again, she's sending panties through the mail. The two are even exchanging I love yous. It is hot and it is heavy, and just like Tommy, Brian is head over heels for the sweet, beautiful Jessie. Except Brian does not know that sweet, beautiful Jessie is still seething about Tommy's deception. Possessed and obsessed about it, pressed and stressed. All while she's professing her love to Brian, she is also telling Tommy every single lurid detail about her relationship with Brian. Because quite simply, she wants Thomas/Tommy to suffer. Despite torturing Thomas with the details of her liaison with Brian, Jessie and Thomas are still saying I love you to each other. They just can't let go. But Jessie is playing in Thomas's face because she's also goading Brian into smearing Tommy's name across the gaming rooms. prompting Brian to say that Thomas/Tommy is a loser, he's a predator, you can't trust him. And so these antics from Brian eventually get Thomas banned or suspended from playing. Brian escalates the situation by taking it to real life. He spills the beans to his and Thomas's coworkers about how he pretended to be this 18-year-old military stud so that he could trick this poor, by now, 18-year-old girl into falling in love with him. And the entire time, Jesse is egging Brian on, and he even asks her for pointers on what he should say. And Jesse is basically like, do you, boo, whatever you want. At one point, Brian even says to her, quote, I have to F with him. So he's getting caught up in this just as much as Jesse is. And so by now, a humiliated and frankly weary Thomas tells Jesse and Brian to just leave him alone. Even Brian seems to get a little tired of his campaign, and he eases off the shame game. However, it seems as though he is about to get a little carrot for his troubles, as Jesse invites him to West Virginia so that they can meet in person. An excited Brian can't help but to let the cat out of the bag that he's going to West Virginia to do something that Thomas never did and could only dream of. Thomas, of course, is incensed that Brian is getting first crack, so to speak, at Jesse, who has claimed to still be a virgin. He is also incredulous that Brian would choose Jesse over their friendship. And in an IM exchange with Thomas, it seems as though with time, Brian is having second thoughts about moving things to the next level of Jesse, saying, quote, I don't know what I want or what I'm going to do with her. Thomas crassly responds, quote, go pop her cherry. Good luck. Brian comes back with, quote, why does it bother you so much? You are much older than her. Facts. Thomas responds with some choice racial and sexual slurs and reiterates that he just wants to be left alone. In the end, Brian decided he was not ready to take that step with Jesse, and he stayed home. And unbelievably, she went back to Thomas, and he took her back. I mean, if this isn't a cuckoo clock, I don't know what is. There is no question that Jesse has her hooks but good into Thomas, who is still pretty raw over what he sees as her betrayal, admitting to her, quote, I still care for you a little, but I want you devastated. And then he goes on to say, quote, why, Jesse? Why F me over like that? At this point, she says, quote, can we start over as friends? Before she pours it on thick about how much they meant to each other, how, quote, you and only you are my connection to Tommy, and I will love him till I die. Thomas responds, quote, I still feel Tommy in my heart. Going on to admit, quote, I never stopped caring for you. While Thomas may still care about Jesse, it does not eliminate his white-hot hostility for Brian, saying, quote, I hate him with a passion, and for 10 cents, I would eliminate him. Payback is an MFer, Jesse. I am the ultimate weapon. I am a Marine. Brian will pay in blood. Whoa. Well, instead of scaring Jesse, which statements like that would any sane person, these declarations seem to turn her on. She admits to Thomas that she still yearns for Tommy, and Thomas says he would give anything to be Tommy for her, saying, quote, I want you so bad, Jesse. I want to hold you and kiss you. And from there, they go full-on Skinamax. ABC News reported that while Thomas admitted the virtual sex made him, quote, feel kind of dirty, he was in too deep to sever ties with Jesse. Thomas's need for Jesse isn't the only unquenchable thirst happening, because Jesse's need for attention/torturing Tommy is insatiable. She openly flirts with other guys in the game rooms, knowing that Thomas will see this, and he pleads with her to stop. But Jesse, she's good. She keeps her man on the hook, telling him point blank, quote, I want you in my life, Tom. Thomas is realizing that Jesse gets off on his pain, and he lashes out, saying he's going to physically harm her or, quote, take something away from you that you love. Thomas said to ABC News, quote, if I was smart, I would have just ended it. but it was like a drug that I needed every day. Jessie shrinks back into the shadows for a while, only to pop up one day to let Thomas know that her mom would like a word. So Mom gets on and chastises Thomas and lets him know, "You need to leave my daughter alone." Thomas says sure, but Jessie has to also leave me alone. Fair is fair. It seems as though the message has been received loud and clear as Jessie goes silent for the next few weeks, until she can't take it anymore and messages Thomas, and he says, "Well, what about your mom?" And Jessie blows it off, says that her mom will never know, claiming, quote, "I have totally defied my ma to be with you." Thomas is elated, basking in their togetherness, that they have found their way back to Jessie and Tommy. Thomas, meanwhile, is harboring dreams that he's going to leave Cindy and move to West Virginia to start a new life with Jessie. As The Guardian reported, Thomas is working out, he's spending a lot of time at the gym, and he starts to tell his coworkers that he's going to leave Cindy and marry Jessie, who he believes is his destiny. His loosening grip on reality seems to be confirmed when he writes a note to himself declaring, quote, "On January 2nd, 2006, Tom Montgomery, 46 years old, ceases to exist and is replaced by a 18-year-old battle-scarred Marine. He is moving to West Virginia to be with the love of his life." Thomas and Jessie fall back into their explicit games, getting darker and more depraved as time goes on. However, it is not enough for Jessie, who craves attention any way she can get it. And towards that end, she adds Brian to her MySpace page and resumes flirting with him. Thomas sees this, which she knows he's going to, and he freaks, goes completely off the rails, telling Jessie, quote, "I can handle you with anyone, but him." He demands to know whether or not the two are back together. Jessie denies it, and Thomas begs to know what she wants from him. She claims she wants, quote, "them to end as friends, not enemies." Thomas is livid, and he tells her, quote, "I'm not an effing yo-yo for you to play with." And now, Jessie says, she says, quote, "I'm asking you to let me go." Thomas responds, quote, "You will pay now, biatch. You better be very afraid now. I told you what would happen if you and Brian got together." Sounds pretty serious. At this point, Jessie warns Brian that Thomas is on the warpath. Brian, however, brushes it off, saying that the two haven't talked in months and that he does not care what Thomas has to say about anything. Brian does admit that Thomas did try to hit him with his car in the parking lot at work, but again, he just brushes the whole thing off. However, he does start to second-guess himself, asking Jessie if she thinks he should alert one of his supervisors or anybody else about Thomas's threats. She doesn't exactly tell him what to do, but she does respond, quote, "Brian, I am really afraid of him." Brian admits, quote, "Yeah, me too. He's crazy." For his part, Thomas unleashes a barrage of crazy in Jessie's direction, calling her all kinds of names and again with the slurs. Jessie tries to diffuse the situation, asking once again for Thomas to, quote, "love me enough to let me go." She apologizes, says she'll leave Thomas alone, which he doesn't believe, and why should he? She's done this before. He is, in a word, mad as hell, and he is not going to take it anymore. 2 days go by, and Thomas sends a message to an MIA Jessie, but true to her word, she's logged off and is accepting no messages. September 15th, 2006. It's Friday night, 10 p.m. Brian has just finished his shift at Dynabraid. He heads out to the parking lot in his truck, parked in the back of the dark, deserted parking lot. He climbs into his truck, about to put the key in the ignition. He doesn't know that the rear passenger tire of his truck is flat. That flat tire, though, is the least of his worries, because before he can put the key in the ignition, someone approaches him from behind and fires 3 shots at close range. He is hit in his neck and his left arm. He slumps toward the armrest. He's dead. Brian Barrett was 22 years old. Because it is Friday night, the factory won't open for 2 more days. Brian also doesn't have any plans for the weekend, so it will mean that his body is not discovered until Monday. Detective Jim Hatch said in TalHotBlond that Brian had a huge hole in his neck and that he was covered in blood, calling Brian's murder, quote, a cold-blooded, methodical execution. After talking to Brian's coworkers, it does not take long for investigators to zero in on Thomas. As The Guardian reported, in the weeks before the murder, Thomas had been bad-mouthing Brian, and at one point, while standing at the time clock, Thomas asked one of his coworkers what time Brian's shift ended. A logical jump is that Jessie is in danger, that Thomas is likely coming for her next. As psychologist Rex Bieber noted in TalHotBlond, quote, Jessie ultimately, from any perspective, committed the worst crime. She had deceived him and exposed him. So investigators track Jessie down through MySpace and alert authorities in West Virginia, who race to her house in Oak Hill. So Officer J.L. Kirk knocks on the door of the small and grimy white house that's set back from the road on a little hill next to a car parts dealer. Jessie's mom answers the door, and when Officer Kirk asks to speak to Jessie, she informs him that Jessie doesn't live there, but in another town. Officer Kirk asks how to get in touch with Jessie. It's urgent that he speaks to her. Inexplicably, Mary says she doesn't have any way to get in touch with her daughter. And Officer Kirk is like, ma'am, I promise I did not fall off the turnip truck. This is your daughter. What do you mean you don't have any way of getting in touch with her? He stresses again that Jessie might be in severe danger, and it is imperative that he get in touch with her. So as Officer Kirk is talking to Mary, it's clear that something's off with her. She seems nervous, she's hemming, she's hawing, and she's clearly, obviously, hiding something. Finally, Mary breaks down and she comes clean. She says to Officer Kirk, quote, I'm Jessie. I've been using my daughter's name on the internet. Holy hell. Can you believe it? I mean, what kind of a cuckoo clock thing is this? Okay, so Jessie, she exists. Yes, she's a real person, but her overweight, middle-aged, bored housewife mother with short brown hair and way too much effing time on her hands had stolen her daughter's identity and used it to whip up these 2 men into a frenzy with provocative pictures, lingerie, cybersex, resulting in Brian Barrett's brutal murder. Yes, Jessie's mother, Mary Schuyler, was the puppeteer behind this entire tragedy. As clinical psychologist Rex Bieber said in TalHotBlond about Mary, quote, there is a cruelty, a violence to her conduct that is just indescribable to me. Mary is instructed to fill out a police report, and she reveals that after the murder, Thomas had called her and supposedly told her, quote, her boyfriend was very easy to take care of, and that no 18-year-old was going to best him. And she didn't call police about this after the fact. At any rate, when investigators finally catch up with Thomas, he denies having anything at all to do with Brian's murder. And so, investigators confiscate his computer and uncover thousands of messages between him and Jessie. Thousands. Speaking of people with too much time on their hands. As The Guardian reported, after he killed Brian, just a little before midnight, Thomas was online, waiting with his own taunting messages for Jessie, writing, quote, you waiting for your BF, that's boyfriend. No response. Another message at 2:15 a.m., quote, come on, your BF, boyfriend. Brian won't mind you talking to me. Gee, I wonder why he would say that. Additional evidence against Thomas includes a peach pit found at the scene with his DNA on it and a gun clip also found at the scene that is traced back to him. Though the murder weapon determined to be a .30 caliber carbine rifle was never found, investigators find a trove of evidence linking Thomas to the shell casings found at the scene. And coupled with everything else, it's enough to make an arrest. So remember, Thomas still has no idea that Jesse isn't real, so to speak. And it is at this moment that cops drop the bombshell on him that it is her mother, Mary, who's been behind the whole thing. Talk about deflating a balloon. Thomas, of course, is stunned by the revelation and reveals in TalHotBlond that he really believed he was talking to an 18-year-old girl, that she had him totally convinced, saying, quote, "She played the part to a T. She was a great actress." He went on to say that one of the things that convinced him that she was the naive one was that she really believed she was talking to a combat Marine away on a covert mission, musing, quote, "Made me think she was an 18-year-old blonde that didn't have no sense." Basically saying he thought she was a bimbo. Thomas cops to being, quote, emotionally immature himself, and that she really did have him wriggling around on the line. Despite all the evidence that says otherwise, Thomas is still laboring under many delusion, refusing to confess to Brian's murder. He even goes so far as to attempt to take his own life. So he starts off by losing about 130 pounds, and he overdoses on some sleeping pills that he found in another inmate's cell. When that doesn't work, his attorney tries for an insanity defense, but the shrinks determine there is no there. And in one last attempt at a get-out-of-jail-free card, Thomas says, well, actually, I have an alibi. I was home with my wife and daughters at the time of the murder, and they'll back me up. Well, Thomas's wife, Cindy, she's not having that, and she's like, no, you were not home with me that night. She's basically like, my name is Les, I ain't in this mess. And then because no low is too low, Thomas even tries to manipulate his daughters by telling them during a prison phone call, which is recorded, quote, "Mom knows that if you guys don't testify, then I'm going to lose and I'm going upstate." Yeah, they ain't testifying for you, bud. Thomas's attorney, John Malloy, finally says to him, listen, in my professional opinion, your chances of beating this, practically zero. Take the L, plead guilty, call it a day. Thomas heeds his attorney's advice and pleads guilty to first-degree manslaughter, which is surprising to me because I admit I would have thought first-degree murder, since he was telling Jesse/Mary that he was going to hurt Brian, which to me speaks to premeditation, but what do I know? At any rate, Thomas would later say that he was coerced into taking the plea, that he didn't understand what he was doing, and I don't know. He probably thought he could play a jury the same way he played that so-called naive 18-year-old online. Thomas was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and as the judge who handed down the sentence, Justice Penny Wolfgang, noted, this was, quote, a love triangle between three people who did not even know each other. Isn't that crazy to think about when you put it all together? These people didn't even know each other, and they're doing the most. Mary's ex-husband, Tim Schuyler, this is Jesse's father, says in TalHotBlond that he did not believe his ex-wife had any remorse about what she did, and in fact, didn't come clean about the extent of her involvement in what had happened, only saying to him, quote, I've done something that's not really good. Understatement. As The Guardian reported, Mary was known to be a slavishly devoted mother to Jesse, who she referred to as, quote, her princess, and her brother, that's Jesse's brother, with those who knew her, calling her, quote, one of the best parents around. Mary was known to be an enthusiastic cheerleader at Jesse's basketball and softball games, and that the two were exceptionally close, going for manicures and doing things like shopping for two prom dresses, one for Jesse's own prom and the other for her boyfriend's prom. Yes, Jesse had a boyfriend, actually like an actual boyfriend and in real life boyfriend. But she was going to go to both her prom and to his prom because, as The Guardian noted, quote, Mary only wanted the best for her little girl. The Guardian reported that Mary joined Pogo for pretty much the same reasons as Thomas, which was to de-stress and pass the time. Her kids were growing up and they didn't need her as much. Her husband worked long hours. She was bored and she wanted to have some fun. I don't know, maybe learn how to play bridge or something. I mean, this is insane. But at any rate, she claimed that winding up in the teen chat room where she met Thomas was a total accident and that she never intended for anyone to fall in love with her, calling Brian, quote, a sweetheart, and that she didn't know how to discourage him without coming clean about who she really was. As for Tommy, she said at heart he was, quote, a child who needed someone to show him that they cared. As for why she continued the charade, well, according to what Mary told The Guardian, it was all for the greater good. She's so benevolent, that Mary. She says that she thought by keeping Thomas occupied, it would keep him from taking advantage of an actual 18-year-old, like she's to catch a predator or something, saying, quote, I should have just let it go. Yes, Mary, you should have. Now, apparently, this is part of what Mary fed to her husband and daughter, right up until she boarded an airplane for the first time in her life to appear before the grand jury in Buffalo. In an ironic turn, as bits and pieces of this started to come out, the actual Jessie is the one who Googled her mom's name and got the whole horrible story, and she's the one who clued in her dad about what her mother and his wife had been up to. Tim acknowledged that his wife was the consummate liar, that she always had been, big things to little things, and that it was a known thing even in her family. They even joked about it. As he said in TalHotBlond, quote, Mary's capable of doing a lot of things if she thinks she won't get caught. Once the whole story comes out and Jessie realizes the true extent of her mother's depravity, she cuts ties with her. Worse, her mother never even apologized. Mary Schuyler was never criminally charged in the case, and as Brian's father, Dan Barrett, said in TalHotBlond, quote, you're stuck with the knowledge that she could do this and walk away. For his part, Tim says in TalHotBlond he thinks jail might have been the cold, hard slap of reality that his ex-wife needed, saying, quote, some days I think that would have been the only thing that would have really drove it home to her that she had done something wrong. After Brian's murder, Mary's computer was confiscated, and it was found to have hundreds of pictures of Jessie taken by Mary without her knowledge or consent. Like, who's the predator here? Unbelievably, Mary had sent her daughter's photos to several other men, not just Brian and Thomas. Cindy and Thomas eventually got divorced, as did Mary and her husband Tim. Mary lives with her parents. Thomas Montgomery was released on parole in January of 2024. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, and show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter to be notified about new episodes. And you can also find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus material and other fun stuff. Learn more about my suspense novels about the dark side of love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.